For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant. A young species. Short-lived. Emotion-driven. Their ships were functional but inelegant, their politics chaotic, their military doctrine quaint. The galaxy tolerated humans the way one tolerates background noise, present, occasionally annoying, and ultimately harmless. Ignored by the galaxy. Dismissed by those in power. When humanity first stood before the Galactic Council, they had asked for cooperation. For shared defense treaties. For contingency planning. They brought projections, simulations, and case studies drawn from their own violent history. Collapse scenarios. Supply chain failures. Enemies that didn't conquer worlds, but broke systems until worlds fell on their own. The Council listened. Then politely declined. Centuries later, the Council faced humanity again. This time, the chamber felt different. The great circular hall was still vast, still adorned with relics of extinct empires and banners woven from starlight. The thrones still hovered in perfect symmetry. But many were empty now. Others bore the sigils of species that had lost entire sectors in the last cycle alone. And humanity no longer stood in the center as a petitioner. They stood as an equal. No worse. They stood as the one species that had not panicked. "You were wrong," began a Varelian counselor, his once brilliant plumage dulled with age and exhaustion. "About the scope. About the scale." The human delegate didn't interrupt. Didn't gloat. She simply waited. "But you were right," the counselor continued, voice tight. "About everything else." The chamber fell silent. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the Council formally acknowledged an error of judgment. Not a tactical error. Not a miscalculation. A philosophical one. They had believed strength meant dominance. Humanity had warned that strength meant resilience. They had invested in fleets meant to win wars. Humanity had invested in systems meant to survive them. When the great unraveling began, when communications failed, trade routes collapsed, and entire civilizations found themselves starving despite untouched planets, it was human ships that arrived first. Not to conquer. Not to command. To stabilize. To reroute supplies. To rebuild networks. To evacuate populations the Council could no longer reach. "You prepared in secret," accused a Threxian warlord, his voice no longer mocking, just bitter. "You stockpiled. You trained for collapse." "Yes," the human replied evenly. "Because no one else would." "Why?" another voice demanded. "Why help us now?" The human delegate looked around the chamber, at the wounded pride, the fear barely masked by formality, the realization settling in that the galaxy had survived not because of its strongest powers, but because of the species it once ignored. "Because," she said quietly, "we live in a universe that doesn't care how impressive you look when things are going well." She paused. "And because we remember what it's like to be dismissed." No one realized how dangerous that mistake had been. Not because humanity sought revenge, but because, when the galaxy finally needed saving, humanity was the only one who had planned for the day everything went wrong. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not all at once. Not openly. Oppression, the Council had learned over millennia, worked best when it looked like policy. Humanity barely noticed the first restrictions. A temporary review of trade compliance. New inspection protocols at hyperlane checkpoints. Licensing delays for human-flagged cargo vessels. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that justified protest. Just enough friction to slow things down. Then the tariffs came. Human exports, manufactured components, agricultural bioproducts, high-efficiency logistics software were suddenly deemed non-essential. Council markets closed their ports. Contracts were quietly dissolved. Long-standing trade partners cited regulatory pressure and cut ties overnight. Trade was cut. Human diplomats filed protests. They were acknowledged. Logged. Deferred. Always deferred. Next came the rights revisions. Human citizens were reclassified under a new designation, limited participatory species. It sounded harmless. Administrative. But the consequences were immediate. Voting privileges within council subcommittees were revoked. Human legal protections in mixed-species systems were weakened. Appeals could only be filed through council-appointed intermediaries, none of whom were human. Rights were revoked. Humanity was told it was for their own good, that the galaxy was unstable, that young species needed guidance during uncertain times. The phrase appeared again and again in official communiques. For galactic stability. When human representatives pushed back, Council security forces escorted them out of chambers they had helped build. When human media outlets reported on the restrictions, Council censors flagged the broadcasts as inflammatory. Then came the final measure. Humanity was declared a containment risk. No accusation was ever made public. No evidence presented. Just a classification change buried in Council records. Human vessels were denied access to major transit hubs. Shared research networks were locked behind encryption keys humanity no longer possessed. Even humanitarian corridors were rerouted, away from human space. Humanity was pushed into isolation. The Council expected collapse. They had seen it countless times before. Cut off a species from trade, information, and influence, and the result was always the same. Internal conflict, resource shortages, political fragmentation. Eventually, capitulation. Some councillors even argued it was merciful. Better a slow decline than open war. But humanity did not fracture. They adapted. When trade lanes closed, humans rerouted internally. When markets vanished, they repurposed production. Entire planetary economies shifted in months, not decades. Civilian shipyards converted to logistics hubs. Research institutions abandoned prestige projects and focused on redundancy, efficiency, and survival. Human networks went dark to the galaxy, but inside, they burned brighter than ever. The Council mistook silence for weakness. They did not see the stockpiles growing in deep space depots. They did not track the quiet expansion of autonomous supply fleets. They did not notice that human colonies stopped requesting aid altogether. Isolation had done what centuries of diplomacy never could. It unified them. Generations grew up knowing the Council not as a distant authority, but as a cautionary tale. Humanity studied Council doctrine, Council failures, Council collapses. They simulated scenarios the Council refused to imagine. Not to seek revenge. To be ready. Years later, when the first non-human systems began failing, when trade collapsed across entire sectors and Council fleets arrived too late, too disorganized to matter, human space remained stable. Silent. Efficient. Prepared. And when the Council finally turned its attention back toward humanity, expecting a broken, desperate species ready to beg for reinstatement, they found something far more unsettling. A civilization that had survived alone. A civilization that no longer needed permission. And a civilization that remembered, with perfect clarity, who had pushed them into the dark, and assumed they would never come back out. Isolation didn't break humanity. It burned away the noise. When the last Council transit gate closed to human-flagged vessels, panic was expected. Economic collapse. Political infighting. The shattering of alliances that had barely held together even under prosperity. That was the model the Galactic Council trusted. It was wrong. At first, the fractures did appear. Old arguments resurfaced, historical grudges flared, and regional interests clashed. Earth argued with the outer colonies. Corporate blocs demanded exemptions. Military commands debated authority. Humanity had never been a single voice, and centuries of shared biology had not erased thousands of years of division. But isolation changed the equation. There was no external arbiter left. No neutral market to appeal to. No council chamber where disagreements could be deferred. Every argument now ended the same way. If we don't solve this together, no one will. Slowly, then all at once, priorities shifted. Borders lost meaning when trade lanes vanished. Ideologies softened when survival was on the line. Old flags still flew, but they stopped being walls and became symbols. Earth was no longer the center. It was simply another node in a vast human network. Old divisions vanished. The turning point came not with a battle, but with a broadcast. A joint transmission, carried simultaneously across every human-controlled system. No pomp. No anthems. Just a plain room, a single table, and representatives from Earth, Mars, the Belt, the frontier colonies, and stations so remote they had never before been acknowledged by name. "We are alone," the speaker said. "That is not an insult. That is a fact." No blame was assigned. No enemy named. The message was brutally simple. The Council would not protect them. No one would. So we will. That day, humanity ratified the Unified Systems Accord. It dissolved overlapping authorities and replaced them with function-based command. Logistics first. Infrastructure second. Defense third. Politics last. Every colony retained cultural autonomy, but strategic decisions flowed through a single, shared framework. All colonies stood under one command. Not an empire. Not a dictatorship. A survival machine. Shipyards standardized designs. A freighter built in one system could be repaired in any other. Military doctrine abandoned territorial defense in favor of mobility and denial. If humanity could not outgun the galaxy, they would outlast it. Civilian and military sectors merged in ways the Council would have called inefficient, until the numbers were run. Every transport was a potential hospital. Every mining platform a fallback power station. Every colony trained evacuation, triage, and rapid reconstruction as basic civic skills. Children learned logistics before politics. Engineers outranked admirals. Supply officers carried more authority than generals. Because humanity remembered its history. They remembered that wars were not won by heroes, but by supply lines that held when everything else failed. The Council never saw the change. Humanity's networks were sealed, encrypted, and deliberately boring to outside observers. No grand fleets. No provocative maneuvers. No declarations of strength. Just quiet, relentless optimization. Inside human space, something unprecedented took root. Trust. Not blind faith, but earned confidence that if one world fell, another would catch it. That no colony would be sacrificed for prestige. That survival was not a competition. If no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. By the time the first Council-aligned systems began collapsing under pressures humanity had warned about centuries earlier, the unified systems were already running contingency scenario 712. By the time Council fleets scrambled to respond, humanity had already repositioned relief assets. By the time the galaxy realized isolation had forged something dangerous. Humanity was no longer a collection of worlds. It was a single organism. And organisms that evolve under pressure do not forget the forces that shape them. They adapt. They endure. And when the universe finally notices them again, it is never as the weak, divided species it once dismissed, but as something forged in the dark, together, and very hard to break. In silence, humanity evolved. No announcements echoed through Council channels. No triumphant demonstrations lit up the galactic feeds. From the outside, human space appeared stagnant. Quiet systems with minimal traffic, conservative energy signatures, and no political noise worth monitoring. Exactly as intended. Behind sealed networks and closed borders, humanity redefined what growth meant. Not expansion. Not dominance. But continuity. The first breakthroughs came from necessity. Cut off from Council-approved hyperlane regulators, human engineers rebuilt their drive theory from the ground up. Old assumptions were discarded. Efficiency replaced raw speed. Human vessels no longer tore through spacetime with brute force. They slipped through it, riding stable gradients that produced less detectable distortion. New engines. They were slower, on paper. But they could run indefinitely. They required fewer exotic materials. And most importantly, they worked even when the galaxy's navigational infrastructure failed. Then came defense. Human scientists had watched Council shields for centuries. Monolithic barriers optimized to stop overwhelming force. Impressive. Elegant. And catastrophically brittle once their thresholds were exceeded. Human shields were ugly by comparison. Layered fields. Redundant emitters. Systems designed to fail gracefully. When one layer collapsed, another absorbed the load. When power dipped, shields didn't vanish. They thinned, adapted, redistributed. Unbreakable shields. Not because they could stop anything, but because they never failed all at once. Weapons development followed the same philosophy. Human fleets abandoned superweapons and planet killers. Those were tools of intimidation, not survival. Instead, they focused on denial systems, electronic warfare, sensor disruption, precision strikes against propulsion, command, and logistics. A disabled enemy ship was more valuable than a destroyed one. A delayed fleet was better than a defeated one. Fleets built not for conquest, but survival. Ship design changed. Human warships grew modular. Components could be swapped mid-flight. Damage control was automated, decentralized, and brutally effective. Crews trained to fight fires, reroute power, and rebuild systems under combat conditions, not as specialists, but as baseline expectations. Even civilian vessels were hardened. Freighters carried point defense arrays. Colony transports doubled as evacuation arcs. Nothing human flew unprepared. The Council never noticed. Their analysts saw no territorial expansion, no sudden population spikes, no aggressive maneuvers. Human systems didn't look like a rising power. They looked like a species keeping its head down. What the galaxy failed to see was scale. Human shipyards multiplied in deep space, hidden within asteroid clusters and stellar debris fields. Automated factories worked without rest, producing components that disappeared into sealed depots. Entire fleets were assembled, disassembled, and reassembled purely as training exercises. Doctrine evolved alongside technology. Human commanders trained without assuming superiority. Every scenario began with disadvantage. Outnumbered, outgunned, cut off. Victory was defined not by annihilation, but by endurance, extraction, and mission continuity. If a fleet survived, it won. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared. Prepared for infrastructure collapse. Prepared for refugee waves. Prepared for enemies that could not be reasoned with and allies that would arrive too late. Prepared for the moment silence ended. And when the first Council distress signals began leaking through fractured networks, when ancient powers realized their elegant fleets could not operate without the systems now failing beneath them, human sensors lit up across unified space. No alarms sounded. No celebrations followed. Humanity had not been waiting for permission. They had been waiting for inevitability. And as their fleets powered up, quiet, resilient, and terrifyingly ready, the galaxy was about to discover the cost of assuming that silence meant stagnation. Sometimes, it means someone is building something you will only notice when it's already too late. Then a new enemy appeared. Not from beyond the galactic rim. Not from some ancient sealed sector. It emerged from the blind spots, the regions the Galactic Council had written off as unstable, unprofitable, or already lost. The enemy did not announce itself with diplomats or declarations. It arrived with certainty. They called themselves the Dominion. At first, reports were confused. Patrols that never returned. Trade convoys vanishing without distress calls. Outer colonies going silent one by one. Council intelligence dismissed the early warnings as piracy, then rebellion, then statistical noise. By the time the pattern was undeniable, it was already too late. Worlds fell. Not after glorious battles, but overnight. Dominion fleets bypassed orbital defenses as if they were suggestions. Planetary shields failed in cascading sequences, not from overwhelming force, but from precise disruption. Communications collapsed. Governments vanished. Entire systems were absorbed before the Council even agreed on terminology. Species were enslaved. Those who surrendered were catalogued, processed, and repurposed. Labor castes. Technical assets. Biological resources. Resistance was not crushed, it was rendered irrelevant. The Dominion did not exterminate. They optimized. The galaxy had never faced an enemy like this. The Threxian war hosts launched punitive armadas and were dissected in open space. Their proud fleets returned as drifting wreckage, engines intact, crews gone. The Varelian Collective attempted diplomacy. Their envoys were returned alive, bearing dataslates outlining compliance requirements and population quotas. Entire civilizations capitulated without firing a shot. The Council convened emergency sessions that stretched into cycles. They argued. They argued over jurisdiction, over who would fund the response, over whether the Dominion constituted a unified polity or a distributed threat. They argued while systems burned. Each counselor defended their own borders first. Fleets were recalled. Defensive lines drawn. Mutual aid treaties were reinterpreted, delayed, or quietly ignored. The galaxy fractured exactly as humanity had warned it would centuries earlier. And still the Dominion advanced. Their strength was not numbers, but cohesion. Their fleets did not rely on shared infrastructure. Their supply lines were internal, mobile, and self-correcting. Where the Council's forces depended on networks that no longer functioned, the Dominion thrived in the chaos. When the first core world fell, panic finally shattered decorum. Emergency beacons flooded Council space. Distress calls overlapped until they became noise. Entire species demanded intervention, then threatened secession when none came. It was during one such session, voices raised, protocols abandoned, that someone finally said the word no one wanted to hear. Humanity. The chamber went still. They survived isolation, one counselor said quietly. They warned us about this kind of threat. They were cut off, another snapped. They have no fleets worth mentioning. That's what we assumed, came the reply. Desperation stripped away pride. For the first time since humanity had been declared a containment risk, a council transmission was routed toward human space. It bypassed formal channels. It carried no demands. Only a request. The message crossed empty systems, fractured networks, and security layers that no longer existed elsewhere. It arrived at the edge of unified human space, and was intercepted instantly. Humanity listened. They reviewed the data. The battle footage. The collapsed systems. The Dominion's methods were familiar. Not identical, but recognizable. Systemic warfare. Infrastructure collapse. Enslavement as logistics. Human analysts didn't panic. They updated scenarios. Within hours, the unified systems classified the Dominion threat as Convergent Collapse Entity, Tier 1. Contingency protocols shifted from standby to active. Fleets that had never been seen beyond human space began to move. Only then did humanity respond. Not with a promise. With a question. What authority would this response fall under? The human liaison asked calmly. The Council bristled. Argued. Then stopped. There was no authority left that mattered. You would operate independently, the Council admitted. We would defer. The human paused. Understood, she said. No grand speech followed. No rebuke. No reminder of past wrongs. Just a final statement transmitted across the chamber. We warned you this day would come. Not so you would fear it, but so you would survive it. The channel closed. Across human space, engines powered up. Shield networks synchronized. Logistics chains shifted from reserve to deployment. Evacuation corridors were plotted, not just for humans, but for anyone still alive in the Dominion's path. For the first time since the crisis began, the galaxy felt something unfamiliar. Not hope. Relief. Because the species once dismissed as weak had not only endured the dark, they had studied it. And now, facing an enemy that threatened everything, the galaxy was about to learn a final, terrifying truth. Humanity had not prepared to rule the stars. They had prepared to save what remained when everything else fell apart. The Galactic Council expected forgiveness. They had rehearsed the language carefully. Regret without admission. Gratitude without submission. They spoke of shared destiny and unity in the face of extinction. Some even dared to frame the moment as reconciliation, as though centuries of dismissal, isolation, and quiet oppression could be smoothed over by desperation. They were wrong. What they found was resolve. Humanity's response did not come from a grand chamber or a symbolic world. It came from a modest command hub buried deep within unified space. No banners. No council observers. Just a human liaison, seated, composed, and very still. The council began to speak. They spoke of the Dominion's advance, of worlds lost and populations enslaved, of the need for immediate, decisive action. The human listened without interruption. When the appeals ended, silence filled the channel. Not an awkward pause, but a deliberate one. Data scrolled in the background of the human's display. Timelines, probabilities, casualty curves. Finally, she looked up. "We acknowledge the situation," she said evenly. Relief rippled through the chamber. Several counselors leaned forward, already preparing their next requests. Then she continued. "We also acknowledge your expectation." Confusion replaced relief. "You believe this moment entitles you to our immediate support," the human said. "That shared threat overrides shared history." The council did not deny it. "We do not operate on entitlement," she went on. "We operate on outcomes." A Threxian warlord bristled. "Every moment you delay, more systems fall." "Yes," the human replied calmly. "We are aware." The words landed harder than any accusation. "We will decide when to act." The chamber erupted. Counselors protested, demanded, accused humanity of arrogance, of vengeance, of playing politics while the galaxy burned. The human did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She waited. When the noise finally faded, she spoke once more. "We are not withholding aid out of spite," she said. "We are ensuring that when we intervene, it works." She gestured, and a projection filled the chamber. Human evacuation corridors, already active. Stabilization fleets, prepositioned beyond council space. Supply chains, rerouted to support multi-species populations. "You see delay," the human said. "We see preparation." The council had built empires on rapid reaction and overwhelming force. Humanity had built survival on timing. The transmission ended without ceremony. There was no promise of alliance. No oath of loyalty. No forgiveness offered or requested. Only action, controlled, deliberate, inevitable. Soon after, space itself began to tremble. Not with explosions. With movement. Hyperlanes distorted as human engines engaged on scales never observed. Deep space sensors across the galaxy registered synchronized power signatures, quiet, stable, and immense. Fleets emerged not in massed formations, but in precise, distributed patterns that rewrote strategic maps in real time. Humanity was not rushing to war. They were positioning for endurance. And for the first time, the Council understood something too late to take back. Humanity had never needed their approval. They had only needed time. And now that time was over. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. No shockwaves. No flaring hyperlane ruptures. No dramatic arrival meant to inspire awe. They simply appeared, sliding into real space along vectors no council chart had ever mapped. Deep space sensors struggled to classify them. Not because they were small. Because they were quiet. Massive formations unfolded across contested systems with surgical precision. Not clustered. Not aggressive. Every ship occupied a position that mattered, interdicting supply routes, severing communication relays, isolating Dominion task groups without firing a single shot. Massive. Precise. Unstoppable. The Dominion noticed something was wrong before they understood what it was. Their fleets advanced as always, confident, synchronized, optimized for conquest. But their forward elements began to slow. Navigation errors multiplied. Orders arrived late, then not at all. Entire wings dropped out of formation, engines throttling down as if space itself had thickened around them. They tried to adapt. They always did. But adaptation requires feedback, and the Dominion was suddenly blind. Human electronic warfare didn't scream. It smothered. Sensors returned data that was technically accurate and strategically useless. Targets appeared where nothing existed. Empty space looked occupied. Occupied space looked irrelevant. Then the message crossed every channel. Council frequencies. Dominion command bands. Civilian emergency nets. One message. No signature flourish. No threat display. Stand down. The Dominion ignored it. They fired. Their opening salvo should have been catastrophic. Enough firepower to sterilize planets. Enough force to shatter fleets built on intimidation and brute strength. Human shields absorbed it. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. They bent. Energy dispersed across layered fields, bled into auxiliary systems, rerouted through ships designed to expect impact. Some human vessels retreated, not in panic, but by design, drawing fire, stretching Dominion formations thinner with every exchange. Then humanity answered. Not with annihilation. With removal. Precision strikes crippled engines. Command ships lost thrust and drifted, intact but helpless. Logistics vessels vanished into containment fields, boarded without resistance. Entire Dominion battle groups found themselves surrounded by ships that did not press the attack, only held position, weapons locked, escape vectors sealed. The Dominion doctrine relied on momentum. Humanity stole it. Across multiple systems, the same pattern repeated. Advance. Confusion. Isolation. Neutralization. No grand battles. No heroic last stands. Just an enemy machine taken apart piece by piece while it struggled to understand why nothing was working. Council observers watched in stunned silence. This was not war as they understood it. There were no victory speeches. No burning worlds reclaimed. No triumphant fleets chasing retreating foes. There was only control. Within days, Dominion expansion halted entirely. Within weeks, their enslaved systems began receiving aid. Human evacuation ships, human engineers, human logistics officers restoring power, water, and communications before political questions were even asked. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Dominion commanders finally attempted surrender protocols, but found there was no central authority to negotiate with. Human fleets did not demand capitulation. They simply enforced stability and moved on. When the last Dominion advance stalled, humanity transmitted one final message, this time to the Council. The threat is contained. Cleanup operations ongoing. That was all. No demand for repayment. No request for recognition. No reminder of past wrongs. Just results. The Council finally understood the truth they had missed for centuries. Humanity did not fight to conquer. They did not fight to rule. They fought to end wars, by making them impossible to continue. And as the galaxy slowly realized it was still standing, saved by a species it had once dismissed, one certainty settled in among the stars. If humanity ever did choose to conquer, there would be no war at all. Only silence. And then, a new order, already in place before anyone realized the old one was gone. The Galactic Council tried to reclaim control. They convened emergency assemblies once the last Dominion formations were neutralized. Charters were dusted off. Authority clauses reinterpreted. Committees reformed to determine jurisdiction over liberated systems. Old habits returned quickly. They spoke of restoring order, of re-establishing borders, of placing humanity back into its appropriate role within the galactic hierarchy. It was too late. The galaxy they remembered no longer existed. Trade no longer flowed through council hubs alone. Human-built logistics corridors now formed the backbone of interstellar recovery. Evacuation routes, medical supply chains, reconstruction fleets, nearly all of them human-coordinated, human-maintained, and human-neutral. Council decrees went out. Some were ignored. Most were irrelevant. Humanity did not challenge the Council's authority. They simply didn't wait for it. Liberated worlds rebuilt under temporary human stabilization frameworks. Not occupations, not protectorates, but scaffolding. Once power grids stabilized and populations were safe, humans stepped back. Governance returned to locals. Cultures were restored. No flags were planted. This unsettled the Council more than conquest ever could. "You have influence without mandate," one counselor accused during a strained session. The human representative nodded. "Yes. And you intend to keep it?" "We intend to leave systems better than we found them," came the reply. "What they choose after that is not ours to dictate." The Council searched for leverage. There was none. Human fleets remained dispersed, never concentrated, never threatening. Their ships didn't patrol borders. They patrolled failure points. Starving systems. Broken infrastructure. Places where collapse might begin again. Humanity did not rule the galaxy. They made rulership obsolete. The truth became impossible to deny. Galactic stability no longer depended on ancient charters or ceremonial authority. It depended on whether humanity chose to intervene when things went wrong. And humanity never announced those choices. They just acted. Some counselors resented it. Others feared it. A few, quietly, were grateful beyond words. Because for the first time in living memory, the galaxy had faced annihilation, and survived without replacing one tyrant with another. There was no new empire. No human throne among the stars. Only a quiet understanding that spread from system to system. When the darkness came, someone had answered. Humanity never claimed moral superiority. They never called themselves saviors. They did not rewrite galactic law in their image. They simply proved a truth the galaxy would never forget. If darkness rises again, if systems fracture and empires fall, if the old powers argue while worlds burn, humanity will be there. Not to rule, not to judge, but to hold the line when no one else can. And that knowledge, unspoken, undeniable, reshaped the galaxy more profoundly than any conquest ever could. Because power can be challenged. Authority can be overthrown. But a species that shows up, every time, when everything is falling apart, that becomes something else entirely. Not masters of the galaxy. Its last defense.